Massachusetts is blessed to have 351 different towns and cities, and each of those has its own Board of Health. So when you want to do something public policy-wise to help people have healthier behaviors, you really have to do it town by city.
Starting in the 1990s, there were local boards of health that were taking it upon themselves to try to protect the public's health from exposure to secondhand smoke.
And at the very beginning, when it was really more of a patchwork of communities moving at different paces.
The Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts ruled that the Barnstable Board of Health could indeed regulate secondhand smoke in indoor workplaces and public places. So that set the precedent for several other Cape towns that had not yet acted.
And so they enacted local regulations to restrict the use of tobacco or smoking tobacco in bars and restaurants.
Back around the early 2000s, several of the Cape towns were moving forward with smoke-free workplace regulations on the local level.
Actually moving with different components of regulations. We had a lot of communities that were concerned about the crossing the border and the level playing field, and they're going to leave my restaurant and go to the restaurant right down the street. It
raised the ire of the restaurant community, which had a legitimate fear in their minds that the regulations would negatively impact their business. And the same was true for the bar owners. The tobacco industry did a masterful job of feeding them with lots of information, negative information, and propaganda that led them to believe this.
So a lot of times we're going back to the same city or town 2 years later and updating their regulation. And eventually, you know, it dawned on even restaurant owners that, you know, I could live with a level playing field as long as everybody got treated the same, and that my restaurant was not treated differently from her bar. And so as long as everybody could be in the same town, then that solved that problem. Then the next problem was people would leave that town.
And through a meeting with John Auerbach and Harold Cox that they had with Cheryl Sabara and DJ Wilson, Clean Air Works was born.
John and Harold, being the wonderful academics that they are, said, well, what we really think we need, there's strength in numbers, and they were right. There is strength in numbers, and we had up until that time really been working city by city, town by town. So what we suggested was that if they thought that this should be something bigger than city by city, town by town, then maybe they could take the lead and start maybe looking at doing something with Boston and Cambridge. And that was really the inception of Clean Air Works.
The beauty of Clean Air Works is that it was a regional approach.
Yeah.
It was a regional approach that had, I think it started with 12 communities, and
12.
then there were a number of others, and it went up to about 19 or so communities that joined the collaborative.
And they really were the leaders in bringing some of the Boston 5 communities into the conversation. And as a result of that, really, their efforts really are what triggered the whole of the state, but really that how do we brand something? How do we move forward collectively? And it was their concept and certainly their direction that led us and brought us all into the fold.
There were coalitions all across the Commonwealth, regional coalitions, where local boards of health would work together in their region to pass smoke-free workplace regulations.
By the end of 2001, the entire Cape and Islands region was completely smoke-free and was, in fact, the first geographic region in Massachusetts to be smoke-free.
It was a wonderful beginning of our interest in regionalization and what it means to regionalize. And we had posters that were made. There were policy templates that could be used by our individual communities. There were strategies that could be used by individual communities.
And so what we saw was in Western Mass, there was Clean Air Works West. We had Clean Air Works South, Clean Air Works North, and then the greater Boston area.
Until tobacco control, this wasn't really something that they exercised. And now here we were, outsiders, coming in to their local Board of Health meeting where they were used to looking at restaurant inspections and Title V issues, and we were asking them to use this plenary legal authority to do something that was very, very controversial. So, I really give them a lot of credit for actually doing this. I mean, it was not an easy thing for them to do.
We saw all of these local boards of health pass these regulations to protect public health from secondhand smoke exposure.
A lot of people understood that lung cancer is the #1 preventable cause of death, and that if people were exposed to secondhand smoke, that was a particularly bad thing to have going on in the workplace. So rather than saying, we're trying to control you smokers and send you outside, we said, we're trying to protect those that are helping you, serving you, when you go into restaurants and bars and other workplaces. And so it became an appropriate approach to changing public policy.
In 2003, Boston went smoke-free in their bars and restaurants. Mayor Menino was a really big supporter of going smoke-free, and John Auerbach was the commissioner at the time.
Part of what the mayor asked us to do before he was going to announce his support was he wanted us to approach the unions and see and get a read from them about whether they also agreed that this was in the interest of the workforce.
And then later on in 2004, the following year, we had Rachel Caprillion and Senator Fargo that really championed through the statewide workplace legislation.
This is the 10 o'clock news on Boston's WB56.
Advocates of a bill that would ban smoking in all workplaces and just about every enclosed space you can think of, including shopping malls and private offices in public buildings, held a pep rally of sorts at the State House, brimming with confidence that their moment of victory may be at hand. This state rep is co-sponsor of the sweeping legislation.
People ought to have the option when they want to go to a public place not to have their health compromised, and that's why it's high time that this bill be adopted.
The whole journey was that of affirmation, that we knew way back when that this was unlikely to change someone's restaurant-going habits, or that smokers would feel maligned, or whatever the case may be, but it would be better indoor air quality for everybody involved. And we saw that play out town by town by town, such that we hit a point of critical mass. Why not take it statewide? And I believe we were the 7th state at the time we passed it in 2004.
And Tobacco Free Mass mobilized a coalition all across the Commonwealth, from nurses and local unions and parents and bartenders and hotel workers to really push for protection of employee health from exposure to secondhand smoke.
And it starts right down at the most local level, the local boards of health, the Massachusetts public health initiatives, the advocates, the nurses, the doctors, the school nurses, the parents. There are so many advocacy groups that we have to thank for this, because it didn't just happen in a vacuum.
Tobacco-free Mass has been essential to the success of the Massachusetts Tobacco Control Program. There's no question about it.
Here we are celebrating 10 years of smoke-free workplaces in the state of Massachusetts, and it's because of all of the work that the local boards of health did to really feed up to a statewide policy.
I think at tonight's celebration, we're celebrating Roger Berkowitz. Roger Berkowitz was
excellent. I'm flattered, certainly, but should you be honored for just doing the right thing, or what's ethically right?
It was very difficult in the early years to get any restaurant that had chosen to go smoke-free to ever say it publicly that they did. So it was very helpful for us to have a notable chain, too, like Legal Seafoods, that had come out way ahead of the curve and go smoke-free on their own. It spoke volumes that it could be done, their restaurants could be successful, and that it was the better thing to do.
The first restaurant I ended up going smoke-free in was Chestnut Hill. Because I figured if I was going to get pushback, it was going to be in Chestnut Hill. And when I got no pushback in Chestnut Hill, then I said, we're going smoke-free everywhere else.
And it was really important to have a successful restaurateur who said, this is good for business. It's not a problem. You know, we adopted the restaurant ban years ago, and we did just fine.
I was anticipating a lot of pushback from those that wanted to smoke. And it didn't happen. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting, because our guests were telling us, because they're very vocal guests, people were thanking me for going smoke-free.
His statement that Legals serves the healthiest protein was something that, in his opinion, just didn't coincide with smoking.
Hey, we're in the business of selling the healthiest of all proteins. And how can we provide it in an environment that wasn't safe? Didn't make sense.
I know that he did a lot of work with Mayor Menino at the time.
I have to give a lot of credit to John Auerbach, because when he was with the Menino administration, he always wanted to do the right thing. And they were pushing the envelope beyond, I think, what had been done in cities before. And they took a leadership role.
Legal Seafood sells wonderful, healthful food, trans fat free. He's very proud of that. But the work that he's done on tobacco, I think, has really set a standard for other restaurants and businesses.
As time goes on, I've learned to appreciate what tobacco-free Mass is doing. Look, at the end of the day, it is promoting really healthier lives and saving lives. And that's something that everyone has to embrace.
I can't thank him enough for being such a public health leader.
So here's to you, tobacco-free Mass, on 10 years and the next 10.
That was one of the most strange and upsetting hearings I've ever been to. And actually, it wasn't a hearing, it was a meeting. I may get some of this wrong, but Weymouth passed a smoke-free, a very broad, comprehensive smoke-free workplace regulation that included prohibiting smoking in restaurants and bars. And the town manager was extremely perturbed that the Board of Health had passed this. So the town manager ordered the Board of Health to hold a post-enactment meeting so that this could be discussed more widely amongst the residents of Weymouth. So they held a meeting, and it was sort of like what DJ said about Yarmouth. There were so many people at this meeting, or they anticipated so many people at this meeting, that they held it in, I believe it was a high school. And the place is jammed. I mean, it's absolutely jammed, standing room only. So we go in, and there were police there, which we frequently boards of health during this time would get a police detail, because you just didn't know how drunk your opponents were actually going to be, because they would come in buses. So we get to this meeting, and this little boy, he must have been about 7 or 8, in a soccer uniform, was one of the first people to speak at this meeting. And he gets up and he says that he has asthma, and that he's so happy now that he can go into Friendly's in Weymouth with his parents after a soccer game because there's no smoking. And no sooner did he get that sentence out of his mouth than people started booing rabidly at this little kid. Just boo, 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 get out of here, we don't need to hear from you. To such an extent that the police officer came in and escorted him out and stopped the meeting. At least that's the way I remember it. It was absolutely, I mean, I have never seen a group of people that were so amazingly disrespectful of this little boy. It was an astounding meeting. I don't think anyone who was at that meeting does not remember that to this day.
I remember I was booed off the stage at this hearing. I was in the 3rd grade. My mother worked for the town of Weymouth Board of Health, and she was very involved with the smoke-free workplace. Reason being that I am an asthmatic, and it was a tough time for us to go many places. Restaurants weren't the same as they are right now. Sporting events, it was really hard to go out as a family without giving me, issues with my asthma. She also has asthma, so it was really tough. But she was asked to have me speak at a hearing that happened at the McCulloch Building or Whipple Center in North Weymouth when I was in the 3rd grade. I think I was about 8 years old, 8 or 9. I was very nervous. It was like the first time speaking in front of anyone other than my mom and dad or my teachers. So I was pretty nervous. I got up there and these big lights were shining in my eyes, sweating, and I couldn't really reach the podium, so they had to get me a big stool to climb up on and stand on. And I was standing on this stool with about 50 to 100 people sitting in front of me, all smokers, listening to what I had to say about why I didn't want them to smoke in the restaurants that I want to go to. And all I remember were the mean mugged faces, the nasty little remarks that people would make, like, get off the stage, you're just a kid, you don't belong here, where are the adults, where's your parents? And when I started to say what I had to say, what I really believed in, not being able to smoke in a restaurant so I could go out to eat, that's when they really got upset. And I don't know if it was because I didn't want them to smoke in the restaurant, or because they thought because they knew it was working. They knew that after this they're probably not going to be able to. It was really part of the beginning of what the Board of Health did to ban smoking in Weymouth and Massachusetts.
Cambridge was actually one of the last of the 19 communities to finally decide to go smoke-free.
I was working at the Marriott in Cambridge in Kendall Square at a bar called Characters Bar and Grill. They took the permits away from the smaller bars and restaurants.
There were a lot of rules at that time. If you happen to have a bar and you had a restaurant that had less than 25 seats, then you couldn't smoke. If you had more than 25 seats, you could smoke. It was very confusing.
So maybe where I had 50% of people smoking, I now had everybody come into my bar to smoke. I was the smoking destination of Kendall Square, and I was on a 34-seat bar, big square bar, plank right in the middle of it. One of my very dear best friends was diagnosed with lung cancer.
The leading causes of death in Boston are heart disease and cancer, particularly lung cancer, and we know that both are very much associated with exposure to tobacco.
I was with her when she died, and to go back to work, and people were just smoking away, and I felt all of a sudden felt very vulnerable. When I decided that this was something that I was going to address with the hotel, in 2000, I sat down and I wrote a letter to my general manager addressing the facts of that our bar was still smoking and the decision to make the banquet room, the banquet area no smoking, made it even more difficult for the workers and Characters. And I made suggestions, because perhaps we should have a smoking room outside of Characters, maybe in one of the meeting rooms that isn't being used, designated for all the hotel guests. And he never responded.
When you go into a restaurant, do you want to inhale that smoke? I don't. When you work behind that bar, you're making a living, do you want to inhale that smoke? I don't think the bartenders or the waitresses do either.
This was bigger than me. This was bigger than my job. This was really important. It was either quit my job or do something drastic. So I threw a rumor out there. Damn it, if I can't get the recognition from my hotel, I'm going to call Channel 4, 5, and 7 on a busy Friday when this place is packed. And I'm going to get myself a gas mask,